At 79 years old, Agnes Holloway had already given everything she had to the people she loved most, a lifetime of sacrifice, devotion, and quiet dignity, and she believed, truly believed, that her family would protect her in return. But her own son had been planning something in the shadows for years. In one devastating afternoon, he stripped her of nearly everything she owned. What he left her with was a property so forgotten that even the county records had lost track of it, sealed shut for 50 years, untouched, invisible. Dale Holloway thought he was discarding his mother like an inconvenience. He had no idea he had just handed her the most extraordinary inheritance in the history of their small Vermont town. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Agnes Catherine Holloway had never been the kind of woman who asked for much. In 79 years of living, she had learned early and well that the most meaningful things in life were rarely the loudest ones. She had grown up in Millhaven, Vermont, a small, unhurried town of covered bridges, church bells on Sunday mornings, and neighbors who still left vegetables on each other's porches without any announcement or expectation of thanks. Her father had been a carpenter who could build anything with his hands. Her mother had sewn quilts for every new baby born in the county and taught Sunday school for 40 years without missing a single week. Agnes had inherited the finest qualities of both of them, her father's steadiness and her mother's generous, unflinching heart. She had married Robert Holloway at the age of 24. Robert was a soft-spoken schoolteacher with wire-rimmed glasses, ink-stained fingers, and a laugh so warm and genuine that it had a way of making the room feel smaller and safer whenever it filled the air. They had built their life together with the deliberate care that people of their generation and their circumstances understood, buying a modest two-story home on Clover Street, painting it white with green shutters, planting a vegetable garden in the backyard that Agnes tended every season with the kind of attention most people reserve for raising children, which she also did, beautifully. They had 3, Dale, the eldest, then Patrice, and finally Marcus, who came as a surprise when Agnes was 37 and Robert said it was a gift from God and meant every word of it. Robert taught mathematics at Millhaven High School for 34 years. Agnes worked part-time at the town library for most of their marriage, cataloging books, running reading programs for children every Thursday afternoon, and quietly becoming the kind of person a whole community depends on without quite realizing it. She organized the library fundraisers. She brought casseroles to sick neighbors. She showed up at every school play, every bake sale, every town meeting. She was not a woman who sought recognition. She was simply a woman who showed up, consistently and without complaint, because showing up was what love looked like in practice. They were not wealthy. Robert's teaching salary and Agnes's modest library income meant that every dollar was counted and every luxury was modest, but there was always enough. The children were clothed and fed and deeply loved. The house was warm in winter and full of light in summer. The garden produced tomatoes every August that Agnes turned into sauce and preserved in neat rows in the cool of the basement. On Friday evenings, Robert would make a bowl of popcorn and they would sit together in the living room watching old films on their small television, and Agnes would think to herself, quietly and without ceremony, that this was precisely what happiness was supposed to feel like. Robert died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in March, 2 years into his retirement. He was 72. Agnes was 70. He had gone out to clear the front path after a light snowfall, something Agnes had told him twice to leave alone, and he simply did not come back inside. The paramedics said he was gone before he reached the ground. Fast, they assured her, painless. Agnes held onto that word for months like something fragile. She repeated it to herself on the nights when the grief became too heavy to carry quietly, when the house on Clover Street felt impossibly large and impossibly silent without the sound of his laugh filling the rooms. She spent the following year learning the slow and unglamorous art of being alone. She was not bad at it in time. She still volunteered at the library 3 mornings a week. She still tended her garden with the same care she had always given it. She joined a watercolor class at the community center, something she had wanted to do for 30 years and never made time for. She became close with her neighbor Frank Dolan, a retired postman with a gentle manner and a habit of leaving fresh vegetables from his garden on her porch without a word, which Agnes found deeply and quietly touching. She ate dinner alone most evenings, but she ate at the table with a cloth napkin because she believed that standards mattered even when no one was watching. Her 3 children were present in different degrees. Patrice, who had moved to Burlington, visited at least once a month and called twice a week without fail. Marcus, who lived in Portland with his husband and their 2 young daughters, came for every holiday and sent Agnes photographs of the girls almost daily, photographs she printed out and put on the refrigerator door in careful rows. She treasured every single one. Dale was different. Dale Holloway was 55 years old, the eldest, and the one who had grown up believing that being the firstborn entitled him to certain things. He had always carried strong opinions about how Agnes spent money, how she maintained the house, how she organized her time. As a child it had been mildly tiresome. As an adult, living 2 towns over with his wife Connie and their comfortable life, it had grown into something Agnes could not quite name. A slow, low-grade kind of control, a gentle and persistent pressure that she had spent years excusing because he was her son and she loved him, and she had always believed, deeply and probably naively, that love could cover a multitude of faults. After Robert died, Dale's attention intensified. He visited more often, but the visits never felt warm. They felt like assessments. He would walk through the house making notes of things: a dripping faucet, a crack in the kitchen ceiling, the age of Agnes's car, the state of the gutters. He would say things like, "Mom, you cannot possibly be managing all of this on your own. And have you thought seriously about what happens if something goes wrong?" He said these things with the practiced expression of a devoted son, and Agnes, who had spent 70 years reading other people generously, told herself that concern was all it was. She was wrong. What Dale Holloway was actually doing was building something, quietly, methodically, and with a patience she had always mistaken for character. Her eldest son was constructing a case, one careful conversation, one worried phone call, one gentle suggestion at a time. And at 79, in the quietest and most vulnerable season of her life, Dale finally decided it was time to act. It started with paperwork. That was the thing Agnes would reflect on later, how ordinary it all looked at the beginning, how something so destructive could arrive dressed in the language of care and practicality. Dale began bringing documents to her visits in the autumn following Robert's death, nothing alarming at first. A form here, a signature there. He explained each one patiently and in the kind of simplified language that Agnes would only later recognize as deliberate, the tone of someone who has already decided the other person cannot be trusted to understand. "It's just a power of attorney, Mum. Standard stuff. It means if anything happens to you and you can't make decisions, I can step in and handle things. It protects you." Agnes had hesitated. She asked if she should have a lawyer look at it first. Dale had smiled the way he always smiled when she said something he found mildly inconvenient. "It's completely routine. Patrice and Marcus both think it's a good idea. You don't want to be a burden, do you? If something happened tomorrow and we couldn't access your accounts, couldn't pay your bills, that would be a nightmare for everyone." She signed. That was the first document. Over the following 8 months there were others. A form consolidating her bank accounts for easier management, an agreement transferring the deed of the Clover Street house into a family trust, a trust that, as Agnes would eventually discover, Dale had structured in such a way that he held sole administrative authority. At the time, he told her it was a tax efficiency measure. He told her Robert would have wanted it. He told her Patrice and Marcus had already been consulted and were fully on board, which was a lie so brazen that Agnes still found it difficult to process even after she knew the truth. She had not consulted a lawyer because Dale had discouraged it every time she raised the idea. "Too expensive," he said, "unnecessary, an insult to the family's ability to handle its own affairs." And Agnes, who had trusted people her entire life and had never once had that trust used against her by someone she loved, had believed him. She had believed him because the alternative, that her own firstborn child was deliberately deceiving her, was simply too terrible to hold in her mind for very long. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The moment Agnes understood what had happened came on a grey Wednesday morning in February, when she went to her bank to withdraw money for a new water heater and was informed, politely and with visible discomfort, that her account had been frozen pending a competency review initiated by her power of attorney. She stood at the counter in her winter coat and felt the floor tilt beneath her. She called Patrice from the parking lot. Patrice, who lived in Burlington and called twice a week and had absolutely no idea what Dale had been doing, arrived at Millhaven in under 2 hours. What they uncovered together over the following days was methodical and complete. Dale had used the power of attorney to consolidate Agnes's savings, nearly $190,000, the accumulation of a lifetime of careful living, into accounts he controlled. He had filed paperwork with the county asserting that Agnes showed signs of cognitive decline and was no longer capable of managing her own affairs. He had done this without any medical evaluation, based entirely on documentation he had assembled himself. Most devastatingly, the family trust he had persuaded Agnes to sign gave him authority to sell or transfer the Clover Street house, the home Agnes and Robert had built their entire life inside, without Agnes's additional consent, as long as he determined it was in the trust's best interest. He had already listed it with a real estate agent. There was a buyer. The closing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Agnes sat at Patrice's kitchen table that night and tried to understand how a child she had nursed through fevers and driven to baseball practice and stayed up late worrying about had become someone capable of this. She could not find the answer because there wasn't one that made sense. Greed rarely makes sense when you examine it up close. It simply takes and takes and takes, wearing the face of whoever you trusted most. Patrice contacted a family attorney immediately. Marcus flew in from Portland within 48 hours, furious and heartbroken in equal measure. But the legal reality was sobering. The documents were signed. The trust was valid. Contesting it would take time and money, and offered no guarantees. Dale, when confronted by his siblings, did not apologize. He said he was protecting the family's assets. He said Agnes was not capable of managing her own affairs. He said it was the responsible thing to do. He said it looking his 79-year-old mother in the eye. And Agnes, who had never once in her life wished harm on another human being, felt something she did not have a name for settle quietly into her chest and stay there. The legal process moved slowly, as legal processes always do when the person being wronged has limited resources and the person doing the wronging has already positioned himself carefully inside the system. Patrice hired a family attorney named Gerald Okafor, a competent and genuinely sympathetic man who reviewed the documents Dale had accumulated and delivered his assessment with the careful honesty of someone who has learned not to soften bad news too much. "The power of attorney is valid," he told Agnes and Patrice in his small Millhaven office. "The trust structure is aggressive, but it was executed correctly. Contesting it on the grounds of undue influence is possible, but it requires demonstrating that Agnes was in a diminished state at the time of signing, which Dale will argue against vigorously, and he has already filed the competency paperwork, which means any court will be looking at Agnes's current cognitive state before ruling on anything." Agnes asked quietly what that meant in practical terms. Gerald folded his hands. "It means the process will take months, possibly longer. In the meantime, your accounts remain frozen, and the house sale will likely proceed unless we can get an emergency injunction, which is not guaranteed." They did not get the injunction. The Clover Street house, white with green shutters, vegetable garden out back, 47 years of living pressed into every wall and floorboard, sold on a Thursday afternoon in March. Agnes was not notified until after the closing. She learned about it from Patrice, who had seen the listing update online and called her mother before she could hear it some other way. Agnes sat in the kitchen of Patrice's Burlington apartment where she had been staying and looked out the window at the unfamiliar street below and said nothing for a very long time. She had nowhere to go. That was the plain and terrible truth of her situation. Her savings were inaccessible. Her home was gone. She was 79 years old with 2 suitcases of clothing, a box of photographs, and her late husband's wristwatch, which she had rescued from the house on her last visit before the sale completed. Marcus offered his home in Portland. Patrice offered her spare bedroom. Agnes loved them both for it and felt the weight of needing them in a way she had never needed anyone, not since she was a child. But Gerald, still working methodically through the documents Dale had filed, found something in the paperwork that Dale had apparently overlooked. In the inventory of assets listed under the family trust, a document Dale's own lawyer had prepared, there was a line item that had been included almost as an afterthought: property, unspecified rural holding, Calder County, Vermont. No address, no valuation, no description beyond a parcel identification number, and a note that read, "Value undetermined, property sealed, condition unknown, historical deed only." Gerald traced the parcel number through the county records office. It took 3 days and 2 trips to the records building in person because the file was so old it had not been digitized. What he found was a deed dating back to 1974, registered in the name of Edmund Hargrove, transferring ownership upon his death to Robert Holloway, Agnes's late husband, who had apparently never mentioned it to anyone, including Agnes herself. The property was a building, a single structure on a modest parcel of land 12 miles outside Millhaven, in a stretch of rural countryside that had been largely undeveloped for decades. According to the county records, the building had been sealed, physically locked and legally designated as a preserved private structure in 1974, the same year the deed was filed. It had not been opened, assessed, or accessed in any official capacity since. 50 years, sealed and untouched for 50 years. Because the property had been registered in Robert's name and passed to Agnes as part of his estate, it technically fell outside the trust Dale had created, which covered only assets Agnes herself had signed over. Gerald filed an immediate motion asserting Agnes's sole ownership of the Calder County parcel. Dale's lawyers, to everyone's surprise, did not contest it aggressively. Their response was dismissive, a single paragraph noting that the property appeared to hold no significant value and that their client had no interest in pursuing it. Agnes read that paragraph 3 times. It reminded her of something, the casual confidence of someone who has already decided a thing is worthless without bothering to find out. Gerald told Agnes she was under no obligation to go to the property. She could continue the legal fight from Patrice's apartment and wait for the courts to unfreeze her accounts. That process might take 6 months. It might take longer. Agnes looked at him across the desk and thought about the house on Clover Street, about the garden she would never tend again, about Robert's laugh, and the 53 years she had spent building something alongside another person, only to have it dismantled in 8 months by the child she had loved first and most fiercely. Then she thought about that sealed building, sitting untouched in the Vermont countryside for half a century. "Tell me how to get there," she said. The drive to the Calder County parcel took Agnes and Patrice 40 minutes on a cold April morning, following Gerald Okafor's printed directions through roads that grew progressively narrower and less traveled the further they went from Millhaven. The maple trees on either side of the route still carried the last thin stubble of winter, not yet committed to spring, and the sky was the flat, pale gray of old pewter. Agnes sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the familiar Vermont countryside give way to stretches of land she did not recognize. She had lived in Millhaven for most of her adult life, and knew the county reasonably well, but this particular corner of it felt genuinely remote. The last paved road ended 2 miles before their destination. What replaced it was a gravel track, barely wide enough for one vehicle, cutting through a corridor of dense pine forest before opening into a modest clearing where the trees pulled back and the land leveled out into a flat, overgrown field. At the far edge of the clearing stood the building. Patrice stopped the car and neither of them spoke for a moment. It was a single-story structure, longer than Agnes had imagined, built from dark red brick that had weathered over 50 years into something closer to brown. The roof was steeply pitched and covered in slate tiles, many of which had shifted or cracked with age, but none of which had fully given way, which Agnes registered as quietly remarkable given the time that had passed. The windows along the front face were tall and narrow, fitted with wooden shutters that had been fastened closed from the outside and secured with heavy iron latches that had rusted into near permanence. The front entrance was a wide double door of solid oak, bound with iron hardware and sealed with a padlock so large and so old that it looked almost architectural, as though it had grown there naturally over the decades. The grounds around the building had not been maintained in any meaningful way since it was sealed, and the evidence of 50 years of untended growth was visible in every direction. Tall grass and bracken had consumed what might once have been a cleared yard. A stone pathway leading from the edge of the gravel track to the front door was almost entirely invisible beneath decades of moss and fallen pine needles. A wooden fence that had once enclosed a side section of the property had largely collapsed, its posts rotted through at the base, its boards scattered and gray with weathering. But the building itself was standing, solidly, stubbornly, as though it had simply decided to wait. Frank Dolan, Agnes's neighbor, had driven out separately at Patrice's request. He was a practical man and he had brought tools, a bolt cutter for the padlock, a pry bar, a heavy flashlight, and a calm, unhurried manner that Agnes was deeply grateful for. He walked the perimeter of the building first, pressing his palms against the brickwork at intervals, examining the foundation, peering up at the roofline with the appraising eye of a man who had spent years making deliveries to every kind of structure in the county. "Bricks sound," he told Agnes when he completed his circuit. "Foundation looks solid. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. It's neglected, but it's not compromised. That roof has held up better than it has any right to, honestly." "Do you know who built it?" Agnes asked. Frank shook his head. "Edmund Hargrove. I knew the name growing up. My father mentioned him once or twice. He was a private man, apparently, kept to himself, had some kind of professional life that nobody in town knew much about. Died in '74. After that, the place just sat." Ruth Ambrose, who ran the small general store at the edge of Millhaven and had known Agnes for 30 years, had mentioned Hargrove once before when Agnes had described the property to her. Ruth had looked thoughtful and said she remembered her own grandmother speaking of him, a quiet, serious man who had moved to the county in the 1940s and whose work, whatever it was, required a great deal of privacy. Nobody had thought much of the sealed building over the decades. It was simply a feature of the landscape, a thing that was there and had always been there and that nobody had any particular reason to investigate. Frank cut the padlock in 2 clean strokes. The iron latch behind it took longer, the rust fighting the pry bar until it finally surrendered with a sound like a held breath releasing. The double doors swung inward slowly, stiffly, the old oak dragging against the stone threshold. The air that came out was dense and still and faintly sweet, the smell of old paper and wood and sealed time. Agnes took the flashlight from Frank's hand. She stepped inside alone. The interior of Edmund Hargrove's building was a single large room that ran the full length of the structure, interrupted only by 2 load-bearing columns of the same dark brick as the exterior walls. The ceiling was high, 12 feet at least, with exposed timber beams running crosswise beneath the slate roof. The light from Agnes's flashlight reached the far wall easily, and what it illuminated stopped her in the doorway for a long, still moment before she could bring herself to move further inside. The room was full, not cluttered, not abandoned in the haphazard way of a place whose occupant had simply walked away and left things scattered. Full in the organized, deliberate way of someone who had spent years building and cataloging a collection with tremendous care, and then, at the end of it all, simply sealed the door and trusted that time would preserve what they had assembled. Floor-to-ceiling wooden shelving units lined 3 of the 4 walls, constructed from the same dark, heavy timber as the ceiling beams. Each shelf was packed tightly with wooden crates of varying sizes, sealed with fitted lids, and labeled in neat handwriting with a black marker that had faded but remained legible. In the center of the room, 4 large work tables were arranged in a square, their surfaces covered with protective canvas sheeting that had grayed with age but held its position, weighted at the corners with smooth river stones placed there deliberately by someone who had thought carefully about what they were leaving behind. Agnes walked slowly to the nearest shelving unit and held the flashlight close to the labels on the crates. The handwriting was precise and unhurried, the penmanship of a different era entirely. Each label carried a number, a year, and a brief description. She read them in sequence, moving along the shelf. Hargrove Collection. No. 1. 1944. Architectural Correspondence. Original. Hargrove Collection. No. 2. 1944-1946. Survey Documents. Northeast Vermont. Hargrove Collection. No. 3. 1947. Patent Filings. Original Copies. Hargrove Collection. No. 4. 1948-1951. Land Acquisition Records. Hargrove Collection. No. 5. 1952. Partnership Agreements. Founding Documents. Agnes moved along the wall, her flashlight tracking from crate to crate. There were dozens of them, maybe more. The shelving units were deep and the crates were stacked 2 and sometimes 3 to a shelf. She estimated, even in the dim light, that the collection numbered well over 100 individual units. Patrice appeared in the doorway behind her. "Mom, are you all right? Come and look at this," Agnes said quietly. Patrice came in and stood beside her mother in the half-dark, reading the labels. Frank followed, and the 3 of them moved slowly around the perimeter of the room together, sweeping the flashlight across shelf after shelf of carefully preserved, meticulously labeled wooden crates representing 50 years of someone's life work, sealed away and abandoned to silence. On the 4th wall, the one opposite the entrance, there were no shelving units. Instead, there was a wide wooden cabinet with double doors, floor to ceiling, built directly into the brickwork as though it had been constructed as part of the original building. Unlike the crates on the shelves, the cabinet's doors had no visible locking mechanism, only a simple iron handle. Agnes crossed to it and pulled. The doors opened smoothly, their hinges preserved against corrosion by a thin film of oil that someone had applied before sealing the room, a detail that told Agnes everything she needed to know about how carefully Edmund Hargrove had prepared this place. Inside the cabinet were 3 shelves. The top 2 held bound ledgers, dozens of them, arranged by year with dates printed on the spines in the same neat handwriting as the crate labels. The years spanned from 1941 to 1973, 1 year for each ledger, 32 years in total, each volume thick with pages. On the bottom shelf there was a single wooden box, smaller than the crates on the walls, roughly the size of a shoebox, and made from a richer, darker wood than the rest of the furniture in the room. It had a fitted lid with a small brass clasp, unlatched. Agnes lifted the lid carefully. Inside the box, arranged in a neat stack, were personal documents. A photograph of a man she did not recognize, standing in front of this very building, smiling. A handwritten letter, 3 pages, folded precisely in thirds, and beneath the letter, a sealed envelope with 2 words written on the front in the same careful hand that labeled every crate in the room. For whoever. Agnes stood in the cold and the quiet of Edmund Hargrove's sealed room, 50 years of preserved silence surrounding her, and picked up the envelope with both hands. She opened it carefully, as though it might dissolve. She began to read. The letter inside the envelope was 3 pages long, written in Edmund Hargrove's careful, unhurried hand on paper that had yellowed at the edges but remained structurally intact, protected by the sealed cabinet and 50 years of undisturbed air. Agnes carried it to one of the work tables, pushed back a corner of the canvas sheeting, and read it aloud to Patrice and Frank in the grey light that filtered through the open front doors. To whoever opens this building after I am gone, my name is Edmund Clarence Hargrove. I was born in Burlington, Vermont in 1901, and I have lived most of my working life in Calder County, which I came to love more than any other place on earth. I am writing this letter in the autumn of 1973, 1 year before I intend to seal this building permanently, because my health is failing and I have no family of my own to inherit what I have spent my life building. I was an engineer by training and an inventor by instinct. Between 1941 and 1965, I developed and patented 17 industrial processes related to cold climate construction and structural insulation, methods for building durable structures in extreme weather conditions that were, at the time, genuinely novel. I did not seek recognition for this work. I licensed the patents quietly through a company I co-founded in 1952 with 2 partners, the Hargrove-Aldcroft Industrial Group, registered in Vermont, which later merged with a larger firm called Northeast Structural Technologies in 1961. When that merger occurred, my patents were absorbed into the new company's portfolio. In exchange, I received equity, shares in Northeast Structural Technologies representing a founding partner's stake. I have never sold those shares. I have never needed to. I live simply, and the royalty payments from the licensing of my patents have always been sufficient for my needs. The shares I hold represent 11% of Northeast Structural Technologies. When I seal this building, those share certificates, along with all documentation of their provenance, will be stored in the wooden crates you see on the walls of this room. Every ledger on the cabinet shelf documents every royalty payment, every licensing agreement, every corporate filing from 1941 to the present. The record is complete. I am leaving this property and everything it contains to Robert James Holloway of Millhaven, Vermont. Robert was my neighbor's boy. He is the only person in 40 years who ever came to visit me without wanting something. He brought me firewood 3 winters running when my back prevented me from cutting my own. He never mentioned it and never expected anything in return. That is a rare quality in a human being, and it deserves to be rewarded. Use what is here wisely. The patents have long since expired, but the shares have not. Northeast Structural Technologies is a growing company, and I believe it will continue to grow. What these shares are worth at the time you read this, I cannot know. But I know they are worth something significant, and I know they belong to someone who deserves them. Edmund Clarence Hargrove, October 1973. Agnes set the letter down on the work table. The room was completely silent except for the distant sound of wind moving through the pines outside. She looked at Patrice, who was staring at her with an expression that hovered somewhere between disbelief and the careful restraint of someone who does not want to say what they are thinking until they are certain. Frank spoke first, his voice measured. Northeast Structural Technologies. I know that name. They went public. Sometime in the 90s, I think. They drove back to Millhaven that afternoon, and Agnes called Gerald Okafor from Patrice's kitchen. Gerald spent 4 days researching. He traced Northeast Structural Technologies through its corporate history, its public listing in 1991, its acquisition by a European infrastructure conglomerate called Aldmere Group in 2004, and its current incarnation as a division of Aldmere with shares still actively traded on the New York Stock Exchange. He verified the share certificates found in the wooden crates against the company's original founding documentation. He contacted a corporate attorney in Burlington who specialized in legacy equity cases, a sharp and thorough woman named Patricia Osei, who flew to Millhaven, examined the crates personally, and spent a week cross-referencing every document against Aldmere's public filings. Then Patricia Osei sat across from Agnes in Gerald's office and told her what 11% of Edmund Hargrove's original stake, carried through every merger and acquisition and stock split across 70 years, had become. Agnes listened without speaking. When Patricia finished, Agnes asked her to repeat the number. Patricia repeated it. Agnes Holloway, who had arrived in Gerald Okafor's office with 2 suitcases and a frozen bank account, who had lost her home to her own son's greed, who had driven 40 minutes down a gravel road with nothing left to lose, sat in a chair in a small Vermont law office, and quietly understood that Edmund Hargrove's 11% stake in Northeast Structural Technologies, after 70 years of growth, was currently worth $960 million. She folded her hands in her lap. She thought of Robert, and the firewood, and the 3 winters running. Then she smiled. Dale Holloway found out about the Calder County property on a Tuesday morning in May, approximately 3 weeks after Patricia Osei had confirmed the value of Edmund Hargrove's shares. He found out the way people find out things they were never meant to know, through a phone call from his own lawyer, who had been contacted by Patricia's office as part of the formal notification process required by Vermont probate law. Dale called Agnes within the hour. She did not answer. She had not answered any of Dale's calls since February. She had no intention of starting now. He called Patrice instead, and when Patrice declined to discuss it, he drove to Millhaven and appeared at Patrice's apartment door with the expression of a man who has rehearsed his justifications carefully and is fully prepared to deliver them. Patrice opened the door, looked at her brother for a long moment, and told him quietly and without particular anger that Agnes did not wish to see him and that any further communication should go through Patricia Osei's office. Then she closed the door. Dale filed a legal challenge within 2 weeks. His argument, assembled by a team of 3 attorneys he hired in Burlington, rested on several claims. The first was that the Calder County property, despite being registered in Robert Holloway's name, fell within the scope of the family trust Agnes had signed because it constituted a marital asset acquired during the marriage. The second was that Agnes, whom Dale had already filed as cognitively diminished in his power of attorney paperwork, lacked the legal standing to enter into agreements regarding the property without his oversight. The third, and most audacious, was that Edmund Hargrove's letter had named Robert Holloway as the intended beneficiary, not Agnes, and that the inheritance therefore should have passed through Robert's estate and been subject to its own distribution, a distribution that Dale claimed entitled him to a portion as Robert's eldest child. Patricia Osei read Dale's filing, set it on her desk, and described it to Agnes in 3 words: ambitious but wrong. What followed was 4 months of legal proceedings that Patricia navigated with a precision and thoroughness that Agnes found both deeply reassuring and quietly thrilling to witness. Patricia demolished Dale's first argument by demonstrating that the Calder County parcel had been deeded specifically to Robert Holloway as an individual, not as a marital partner, and that no documentation connecting it to any shared marital asset existed. She demolished his second argument by arranging a formal cognitive assessment for Agnes, conducted by a panel of 3 independent neurologists, all of whom concluded in writing that Agnes Catherine Holloway was completely and unreservedly competent to manage her own affairs. She demolished his third argument by producing Edmund Hargrove's original will, located in the Calder County probate records, which stated unambiguously that the property and all its contents were to pass to Robert Holloway and, in the event of Robert's death, to his surviving spouse. His surviving spouse, Agnes. The courts ruled in Agnes's favor on every point. Each of Dale's arguments was dismissed in turn, the final ruling delivered on a grey September morning that Agnes spent in Patricia's Burlington office drinking tea and reading quietly while the verdict came through. Patricia walked in, sat across from her, and said simply, "It's done. Every count, you won." Agnes nodded, finished her tea, and looked out the window at the street below. But Patricia was not finished, because in the course of researching Dale's claims, her office had uncovered something else. Evidence that the competency paperwork Dale had filed in February had been constructed using falsified documentation. A letter purportedly from Agnes's physician asserting cognitive decline had been submitted to the court without that physician's knowledge or authorization. The physician, when contacted, stated clearly that he had never written or signed any such letter and had never had any concern whatsoever about Agnes's mental capacity. Patricia filed a criminal complaint the same week the civil ruling came down. Dale was charged with fraud, forgery, and financial elder abuse under Vermont state law. He was arrested on a Wednesday morning. His wife Connie filed for divorce before the month was out. The Burlington attorneys he had hired withdrew their representation when it became clear the criminal charges were serious. He was left with a public defender and a case that, as that defender eventually told him with the resigned honesty of someone who has assessed the evidence clearly, did not look favorable. Dale Holloway pled guilty to 2 of the 3 charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was ordered to repay every dollar he had taken from Agnes's accounts, with interest. He served 8 months in a minimum security facility and was released on probation with a record that followed him like a shadow into every room he entered afterward. Agnes's frozen accounts were unfrozen. The Clover Street house had been sold and could not be recovered, but Agnes no longer needed it. She had somewhere else to go now. Agnes did not move back to Millhaven right away. She stayed in Patrice's Burlington apartment through the autumn, giving herself the unhurried time she had never properly allowed herself to grieve, for Robert, for the house on Clover Street, for the version of her family she had believed in for 55 years before Dale had dismantled it. She walked the streets of Burlington in the mornings, slowly and without destination, the way she had learned to walk after Robert died, not going anywhere in particular, just staying in motion, trusting that movement itself was a form of healing. She painted watercolors in the afternoons, the hobby she had taken up after Robert died and had never quite stopped. She called Marcus every Sunday evening and listened to his daughters describe their weeks in the detailed, digressive way of young children who assume all adults share their enthusiasm for minor events, which Agnes did, genuinely and completely. She thought often about Edmund Hargrove, about a man who had lived quietly and worked carefully and trusted that the right person would eventually find what he had left behind. About Robert, who had carried firewood through 3 Vermont winters to the home of an elderly neighbor without mentioning it to anyone, including his own wife. She had not known about the firewood until she read Hargrove's letter. That was the detail that stayed with her longest. 30 years of marriage, and she had not known, because Robert had not told her, because it had not occurred to him that it was worth telling. It was simply something he had done because it needed doing and he was nearby. That was the kind of person she had loved. And that was the kind of person she intended to spend whatever remained of her life honoring. In November, Agnes drove back to Millhaven with Patrice and met with Patricia Osei and Gerald Okafor together in Gerald's small office. She had spent 3 weeks writing out, in longhand, what she wanted to do with Edmund Hargrove's legacy. Patricia reviewed it, refined the legal structure, and told Agnes it was one of the most thoughtful estate plans she had encountered in 20 years of practice. Gerald, who was not typically a sentimental man, sat quietly through most of the meeting and said very little, which Agnes had come to understand was his way of expressing profound respect. The Agnes and Robert Holloway Foundation was established on the 1st of December. Its primary purpose was the preservation of Vermont's rural architectural and engineering heritage, a direct continuation of Edmund Hargrove's own life work, updated for the present century. The foundation funded the restoration of historically significant rural structures across Calder County and the surrounding region. It established a grant program for young engineers and architects working on cold climate construction methods, a field Edmund Hargrove had pioneered and that remained critically relevant in a changing climate. It created a permanent archive of Hargrove's original patents, correspondence and survey documents, housed in the restored Calder County building itself, which Agnes had contractors carefully rehabilitate over the spring and summer following the legal settlement. The restoration of the Calder County building took 7 months. Agnes visited the site every week without fail, regardless of weather, and Frank Dolan, whom she had hired to oversee the project, eventually began leaving a thermos of coffee on the front steps in anticipation of her arrival, an arrangement neither of them formally acknowledged but both of them appreciated. The building that emerged from the restoration was faithful to Hargrove's original structure in every essential way. The dark red brick was cleaned and repointed. The slate roof was repaired tile by tile, with matching slate sourced from a quarry in the same county. The tall, narrow windows were reglazed. The oak double doors were stripped, treated, and rehung on new hardware, though Agnes asked the carpenter to preserve the original iron handle on the cabinet inside, which she would not allow anyone to replace. The interior was transformed into something that honored both its history and its new purpose. Hargrove's shelving units were restored and the crates remained exactly where he had placed them, now properly catalogued and climate-controlled. The 4 work tables in the center of the room were refinished and put back into use as research surfaces, available to the scholars and engineers and historians who began arriving within months of the Foundation's establishment. A small reading room was added at the rear of the building, lined with bookshelves and furnished simply, with 2 armchairs positioned near a wood-burning stove that Agnes insisted on including, because she felt that important thinking was best done in a warm room. She hired Frank Dolan to oversee the restoration project. He accepted without hesitation and turned out to be extraordinarily good at it. She hired Ruth Ambrose to manage the Foundation's community outreach in Millhaven, connecting local residents with the grants and resources the Foundation offered. Ruth brought to the role the same warmth and practical intelligence she had brought to running her general store for 25 years, and within 6 months had established relationships with 17 rural communities across the county. She hired a young archivist from the University of Vermont named Clara Webb, who spent 18 months cataloging every crate in Hargrove's collection and produced a scholarly paper on his contribution to structural engineering that was published in 2 academic journals and cited widely. Clara stayed on after the paper was published, drawn into the depth of the archive in the way that certain people are drawn into certain work, recognizing instinctively that they have found the place where their particular abilities are most needed. The Foundation also established a scholarship in Edmund Hargrove's name, awarded annually to a Vermont student pursuing engineering or architecture at the undergraduate level, with preference given to students from rural communities who demonstrated both academic merit and the kind of quiet, practical commitment to their work that Hargrove himself had embodied. The first recipient was a 17-year-old girl from a small town near the Canadian border who wanted to design cold-climate housing for remote communities. Agnes attended the scholarship presentation in person and shook the girl's hand for a long time and told her that she reminded her of someone she had once known, though she did not specify who. Agnes herself moved into a small house on the outskirts of Millhaven in the early spring, a modest property with a south-facing garden that she began preparing for planting with the same deliberate attention she had once given to the garden on Clover Street. The new house was smaller than the old one, and quieter, and entirely her own, and she found, somewhat to her surprise, that she preferred it. She had never needed very much space. What she had needed all along was simply the freedom to occupy whatever space she had on her own terms. Nora, Agnes's granddaughter, Marcus's eldest daughter, 14 years old and possessed of her grandfather's quiet intensity and her grandmother's steady hands, came to visit the restored Calder County building with her father one Sunday afternoon in June. She walked slowly around the room where the crates still lived on their shelves, now properly lit and temperature-controlled, and stopped in front of the cabinet where Agnes had found Hargrove's letter. She stood there for a long time without speaking, her eyes moving across the cabinet's doors with an expression that Agnes recognized from Robert, that particular quality of stillness that meant a mind working hard beneath a calm surface. Then she turned to Agnes and asked if she could read the letter. Agnes gave her the original. Nora read it twice, carefully, the way Agnes had taught her to read things that mattered. Then she folded it precisely in thirds, the way Hargrove had folded it, and handed it back. "He trusted that the right person would come," Nora said. "He did," Agnes agreed, "and they did." Agnes looked at her granddaughter, this serious, bright, unhurried child who carried Robert in the way she moved through rooms, and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized, after a long time without it, as peace. She thought about what Nora might become, what she might build, what she might leave behind for whoever came after her. And Agnes understood, with the clarity that sometimes arrives quietly and without announcement in the later years of a long life, that legacy was not about wealth or property or the careful accumulation of things. It was about the quality of attention you brought to the people and work in front of you day after day without expectation of recognition. It was about firewood carried in winter. It was about letters written to no one in particular, folded in thirds, left in a cabinet for whoever the world decided to send. On the first anniversary of finding Hargrove's letter, Agnes stood on the restored front steps of the Calder County building at a small dedication ceremony attended by Patricia Osei, Gerald Okafor, Frank Dolan, Ruth Ambrose, Clara Webb, Patrice, Marcus, and Nora. Local journalists came. A reporter from a Burlington paper had heard the story and written about it, and the story had traveled further than any of them expected. Letters arrived at the foundation from people across Vermont and beyond, from engineers who had built careers on techniques related to Hargrove's patents, from historians who had wondered for years what had become of his archive, from ordinary people who had simply read the story and felt something shift in them at the idea that a quiet man's careful work could outlast him by 50 years and arrive exactly when it was needed. Agnes read every letter personally. She answered as many as she could, in her own handwriting, on plain white paper. It took time, and her hands were not as steady as they had once been, but she felt strongly that letters written by hand deserved responses written by hand, and she was not willing to compromise on that. Agnes spoke at the ceremony briefly, without notes. "I came to this building with nothing," she said. "I came because there was nowhere else to go, and because a good lawyer found a parcel number in a document my son hadn't bothered to read carefully. I came because a quiet man cut firewood for an old neighbor and was remembered for it 50 years later. I came because the things we do without expectation of reward are the things that outlast everything else." She paused, looking out at the faces in front of her, these people who had shown up for her, in different ways and at different moments, throughout the hardest year of her life. "I am 79 years old. I have been told, by people who should have known better, that my life was essentially complete, that the useful part was over, that what remained was something to be managed rather than lived." She shook her head slowly. "They were wrong. They will always be wrong about that. Because the most extraordinary thing that has ever happened to me happened at 79. In a sealed room, on a cold April morning, with nothing in my hands but a flashlight and nowhere left to fall." She paused again, and in the quiet she could hear the wind moving through the pines at the edge of the clearing, the same wind that had been moving through those trees for 50 years while Edmund Hargrove's building waited. Edmund Hargrove lived a quiet life and did careful work and trusted that it would matter to someone someday, even if he never got to see it. Robert Holloway carried firewood through the cold without telling anyone because it was the right thing to do, and telling anyone would have changed what it was. These are not grand gestures. They are not the kinds of things that make headlines, but they are the things that last. They are the things that find you at 79 in a sealed room when everything else has been taken away. She looked at Nora, who was standing at the edge of the small crowd with her father's arm around her shoulders, watching her grandmother with an expression that Agnes hoped she would always remember. "Dreams do not age," Agnes said, "and neither does the kind of strength that comes from having absolutely nothing left to lose." The crowd applauded. Frank Dolan looked at his shoes and cleared his throat several times. Ruth Ambrose did not bother pretending she was not crying. Patricia Osei stood with her arms folded and her chin lifted, and the particular expression of a woman who has fought hard for a just outcome and is allowing herself, briefly and without apology, to feel the satisfaction of it. And Agnes Catherine Holloway, 79 years old, stood in the Vermont sunshine in front of a building that had waited 50 years for the right person to open its doors, and felt, with complete and uncomplicated certainty, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.